Now, what's the matter with Kansas? Well, one last thing. Thanks to the Republican-dominated legislature that just voted to roll back the governor's massive tax cuts. Well, let me explain. Now, the past 5 years, of course, Kansas has been an experiment in trickle-down supply-side economics. Basically, what they did is that they cut taxes to the bone. Now, they actually thought that, man, that would create so much growth. It would be amazing. So much growth, our head will spin. So let's cut all the taxes, and it's going to be fantastic. Well, it turns out that it did the complete opposite. It actually wrecked the state. So what did it exactly do? Well, some of the negative things, according to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, is that since it took effect in January 2013, total employment in Kansas has risen only by 2.6%, compared to 6.5% nationally. Private sector employment in Kansas has risen 3.5%, compared to 7.6% nationally. So, look, that's pretty bad compared to the rest of the nation. But wait, didn't they promise that there were going to be so many jobs? Man, if you just cut taxes to the bone, then all these jobs, they're going to rush in. These companies are going to vote with their feet, and they're going to shuffle right into Kansas, and Kansas is going to be the job capital of the world. Well, that didn't happen. Now, what about the economic growth? The state's economy, according to the Center for Budget Policy and Priorities, has grown less than half as fast as the national economy. Kansas's gross domestic product grew at 4.8% from the end of 2012 through the fourth quarter of 2016, while national GDP rose 11.9%. What about businesses? Now, as I said, we're supposed to get all these new businesses in Kansas, right? Kansas's share of newly opened business establishments in the United States had actually declined slightly rather than increased. So actually, less people went to go create new businesses in Kansas. Why? Because their infrastructure was a wreck, because they actually weren't collecting any tax money. Now, what about income tax revenues? Well, of course, if you cut taxes, you're going to have less revenue. Duh. Now, for some reason, they think, no, you don't understand. There's going to be so much economic growth that it's going to boost revenue. We're going to actually collect more in taxes by cutting tax rates, which, again, is completely ridiculous because it's not what happened. Personal income tax revenues in the first fiscal year ending June 30th, June 30th, 2016, were almost $700 million lower than those received in fiscal year 2013 before the tax cuts were enacted. Total general fund revenues in 2016 were $570 million below 2013 levels, despite significant sales and cigarette tax increases enacted to partially offset the income tax losses. So again, they cut income taxes and they raised sales tax and they raised taxes on cigarettes, and still that wasn't nearly enough. Like economists were saying, hey man, that's not going to be enough to replace those income taxes and business taxes. It's just not going to be enough. Oh no, economic growth. We're going to have lots and lots of economic growth. You'll see, we cut those taxes. You'll see all this stuff happen. Well, it didn't. It didn't happen. The opposite happened. Not only that, but the reduction in infrastructure spending had forced the state to postpone numerous highway projects indefinitely. And not only that, but of course, the state would be unable to fund and finance road maintenance. So look, now you're going to have destroyed infrastructure. You can't fix the roads. You can't afford it. So what are you going to do? Well, you've got to raise taxes, right? Here's another effect before I get to that. Kansas's bond rating had been downgraded twice, once in 2014 and most recently on 2016. Lower bond ratings means that the state will likely have to pay a higher interest rate on future borrowing, raising the cost of infrastructure projects such as school construction and road building. And when it came to schools, by the way, they cut funding so much for education that the Supreme Court had to step in and say, you are funding it too little. We're going to force you to put more funding into the schools. Because you can't just not fund the schools. You have to fund them. So that's what they did. Now, earlier this year, to show you how bad it had gotten, Because they said, okay, well, look, maybe it'll get better with time. Well, it didn't get better with time. It got worse. Earlier this year, 5 years after they enacted these tax cuts, or about 4 years actually, they had a deficit of $900 million. What happened to all that economic growth? What happened? It didn't materialize. It's not there. Turns out you ended up getting the opposite: lower economic growth, less new businesses created, less people working, lower bond ratings, and giant deficits. And it's especially sad when you compare it to some of the neighboring states that went in the opposite direction and actually put in more progressive taxation, higher taxes on the rich. It really kind of shows you how this experiment was an absolute failure. It was a bad policy. Now, slashing, like when you slash taxes to a certain point, it ends up providing diminishing returns. Some tax cuts, for example, can spur some short-term growth. That's what we saw when we cut them from like 90 to 70%. Yeah, you're going to have some spending. You're going to have some growth. Things will get better in the short term. Long term, it leads to deficits, unfortunately. But this is why supply-side economics is an absolute failure. And now even Republicans see it. Recently, the Kansas legislature voted on a measure to raise taxes by $1.2 billion across the state. Now, this is, by the way, a Republican majority. Working with the Democrats in a bipartisan majority passed these tax increases. Now, they tried to pass it earlier. They ended up getting vetoed by Governor Brownback. So, recently, I mean, this happened a while back when they tried it the first time. They came back again and said, okay, this time, when you veto it, we're going to overturn your veto. And what happened? They overturned the veto. They had this bipartisan majority through the House and the Senate, mostly Republicans, but working with the Democrats. They overturned the governor's veto on this tax increase. That's amazing. Now, so what actually did they approve? Under this plan, everyone, and I mean everyone, will pay more taxes. Even low-income earners would pay a little bit more under the new plan. Businesses would also be required to pay more in taxes as well. However, families would be able to claim a tax credit for childcare, a provision eliminated under Brownback's 2012 tax plan. Now look, paying taxes kind of sucks, right? But as you can see from the example of Kansas, you do need taxes to pay for certain things. Growth will not magically appear without some sort of revenue, without government investment. You can't just cut all the funding for things and expect you to somehow end up with more money. It doesn't work. And now some of the voters, they seem to understand that. In 2016, for example, in some of these elections, they actually kicked out a handful of anti-tax Republicans in favor of challengers who did back higher taxes because they were tired of the government being ineffectual. And it should be obvious, I think, when you look at the example of Kansas, that you cannot cut your way to prosperity. Now, there has to be a system where wealthier people pay more taxes than, for example, middle-class people or poor people. In fact, the richer you are, the more you have to pay in taxes. That's a system that seems to make sense. And then when you collect that tax money, it gets distributed to different things that will actually help society. For example, schools, roads, bridges. That seems to be a novel concept, but something that other people have tried and seems to work. Progressive taxation and investment in communities and infrastructure. Who knew? But seriously though, Kansas, there should be a case study on how cutting taxes to absurdly low levels does not actually help growth. It actually harms it. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.